Students feared him, not because of cruelty, but because of something they couldn't name. There was a piercing gleam in his eye if he saw what others tried to hide. Friedrich, the teacher, believed himself to be a man of impeccable virtue, a bastion of integrity in a corrupt world. Convinced that honesty separated him from the weak and liars, he lived much of his life believing that moral clarity was synonymous with inner purity. But this certainty was his deepest blindness. The man who judged others didn't realize he carried within himself the same poison he condemned. The evil he fought against externally grew silently within him, waiting for the right moment to reveal. It was then that fate led him to an encounter that would change everything. Carl Jung received him in silence, with the steady gaze of someone observing not the man in front of him, but the mind that governs him. Jung listened, without interruption, to Friedrich's long string of accusations: the unfaithful wife, the dishonest assistant, the envious colleagues, the whole world conspiring against a single just man. When his voice began to waver, Jung asked only one thing: what is the pattern among all these people? Friedrich answered without hesitation: they are all false, selfish, self-serving. Jung waited a few seconds and asked, what is the one constant element in all these stories? The silence that followed was heavier than any words. Friedrich's mind reeled. For the first time, he felt the weight of something he had never considered. What if the problem wasn't with them, but with him? It is at this point that Napoleon Hill enters as an invisible presence, like an ancient voice resonating amid the thoughts of a man in collapse. Hill, the scholar of mental laws, is said to have said that the human mind is a machine for reflections, and the world is nothing more than the mirror in which beliefs are revealed. Friedrich stood before this mirror and did not recognize his face. His moral indignation, his rage, his sense of injustice, all were the amplified reflection of what he denied within him. Hill called this one of the invisible laws of the mind, the principle of correspondence. The exterior is always the continuation of the interior, and the man who does not understand himself becomes a prisoner of the reflection he has created. But Friedrich didn't understand laws. He understood only pain. The idea of being responsible for his own misfortune seemed an intolerable offense. He was the righteous one, the betrayed one, the pure one. How could he also be guilty? His mind fought against the revelation, clinging to the old narrative that the world was unjust and he was a victim of others' wickedness. Jung silently observed the exact moment the wall began to crack. Hill, had he been present, would have recognized this moment clearly. It was the turning point of consciousness, when the ego realizes that its moral armor is merely fear disguised as virtue. Collapse is not punishment, it is birth. It is when the unconscious forces the truth to emerge. Over the next few days, Friedrich began having strange dreams. He saw himself pursued by faceless figures, each representing an emotion he was trying to suppress: fear, anger, desire, envy. They all stalked him like shadows, demanding to be recognized. He would wake sweating, his heart racing, feeling as if something were watching him from within. Hill described this phenomenon simply: whenever the mind rejects, fate repeats until man learns. This was what was happening. The shadow, this set of denied psychic forces, was trying to emerge, not to destroy him, free him from the lie he had constructed. From that point on, Friedrich began to oscillate between two worlds: the world he knew, predictable, structured, full of enemies, and a new, invisible world that seemed to be born within him and challenged all his certainties. Jung observed him with the patience of someone who understands that healing comes not from experience, and Hill somehow guided that process invisibly, as if spiritual laws were manifesting through himself. Man is a slave to what he does not understand in himself, Hill. But the moment he sees his ignorance is the very moment he begins to govern his destiny. Friedrich, however, still resisted. Each revelation felt like a blow to his identity. How could he accept that his entire life, his entire struggle for morality, had been merely a disguise for the fear of being imperfect? He felt torn between pride and guilt. In this confusion, Hill's words echoed, even if he wasn't consciously aware of them. Thought is the seed of all creation. If you sow guilt, you will reap punishment. If you sow conscience, you will reap freedom. It was too simple for a man accustomed to complicating things. But the truth, as Hill said, is always simple. It's the ego that makes it unbearable. Friedrich's body began to react before his mind could accept it. He lost sleep, his appetite, and the desire to speak. He felt a strange fatigue, as if his vital energy were being drained. Jung knew this was the price of resistance. The more a person tries to deny what they are, the more fragmented they become. The psyche then does what it must: implode. Hill called this phase the disintegration of false belief, the moment when the mental system collapses so that a new structure can emerge. So it happened. Friedrich collapsed, hospitalized. The man who saw himself as the guardian of truth became the living example of a mind that had lost touch with its own. But Hill, if he had observed him, would not have seen failure. He would have seen the beginning of reconstruction. Pain is the sign that the mind is trying to expand beyond the limits of the ego. Collapse was the soil plowed before the harvest. Jung, inspired by the same vision, knew that Friedrich was not sick, he was being born again. The destruction of the old self was the first step toward liberation. The shadow had finally broken the surface, and with it come the power that had always been repressed. In the following days, between delirium and flashes of lucidity, Friedrich began to hear something different within him. A calm, formless voice that questioned him with tenderness and firmness. "Why do you defend yourself so?" he said. "What are you afraid you'll find if you look within?" He tried to ignore it, but the voice persisted. It was as if his own thoughts began to divide between the self that suffered and the self that observed the suffering. Hill would have called this voice the universal intelligence, the inner spark that speaks when the noise of the mind ceases. Jung called it the self. The name mattered little. What mattered was awakening. This voice began to show Friedrich images of his own life in a different light. The betrayals that had hurt him, the disappointments, the humiliations, everything was reorganized into a mosaic of learning. He began to understand what Hill had always preached. Nothing is against you. Everything is a reflection of what you don't yet understand. The assistant who challenged him represented his repressed ambition. The wife who left reflected his inability to love without control. The colleagues who envied him merely mirrored the pride he tried to disguise with virtue. His entire life had been a mirror, and he, blinded by his certainties, fought against his own reflection. Hill would have smiled. The outer world is the canvas on which the mind projects its inner state. If you want to change the canvas, don't paint over, change the artist. Friedrich was finally beginning to change the artist. For the first time, he questioned his self-image, and in doing so, something within him stirred. A silent space opened, and within it dwelt a peace that did not come from reason. It was the beginning of awakening, the very thing Hill described as the moment when man stops reacting to the world and begins consciously creating it. Friedrich's collapse, therefore, was not a fall, portal. Jung understood this. Hill, if he had been present, would have called it the transmutation of pain. The mind, previously turned outward in search of culprits, began to turn inward. And in this movement, the first spark of creative power was born. The shadow, once an enemy, became a master. Guilt transformed into self-knowledge, anger into directed energy, despair into fertile silence. Friedrich didn't know it yet, but he was only at the beginning. The ego had been shattered, and the real work was about to begin. And it is here that Napoleon Hill, the thinker of invisible laws, seals the lesson of this first part. No man awakens through harmony. Awakening comes when the mind can no longer bear its own deception. What Friedrich called a collapse was, in fact, the shock of the soul trying to free itself from the prison of the character. What he believed to be the end was the starting point of pain, was merely the hammer that opened the safe where consciousness was locked. And now, for the first time, he began to hear the sound of metal breaking. The mirror was cracked, and through the crack, light began to enter. Friedrich awoke from his collapse like someone returning from a deep dive. He didn't know how much time had passed, but he felt like a man who had died and returned, unsure of whose body he was inhabiting. The hospital where he was confined was too silent, cold, and clean to seem real. Sometimes he found himself staring at the white ceiling and wondering if he were still alive. His mind wavered between the tormenting past and a present that seemed suspended, formless. Everything that had once given him meaning, his work, his morals, his reputation, had dissolved. The man who claimed to know the truth now no longer knew who he was. Jung visited him in short intervals, asking questions that seemed simple but disarmed everything he thought he knew. "Who is the enemy now?" he asked once. Friedrich hesitated. "I don't know," he replied. "Maybe ... No one." It was the first true answer he had given in a long time. In the days that followed, he began to recall fragments of old relations. Scenes that had previously seemed banal now took on new meaning. He remembered when a student corrected him in class and he humiliated him in public. Arrogance is a form of self-protection, he'll say. If those who fear being small pretend to be great. He remembered his wife, who tried to talk about feelings, and how he silenced her with phrases about logic and duty. Those who do not accept their own vulnerability call love weakness. He also remembered his assistant, a curious young man he believed stealing his identity. Now he realized the young man wasn't stealing, he was thinking freely, something Friedrich had forgotten how to do. These memories were accompanied by a strange pain, different from ordinary. It was a lucid pain, as if he were waking from a long dream and realizing the distortions his mind had created. Hill would call this stage the confrontation with one's own reflection. It is the moment when a person begins to recognize the voices that have inhabited him throughout his life. The voice of fear, vanity, the need for control, and understands that none of them are him. Friedrich began to hear these voices clearly. When the nurse delayed his medication, a part of him would whisper, "See, they still disrespect you." And soon another voice, calm, would respond, Do you still believe the world revolves around hurting you? This second voice grew stronger with each passing day. It was the silent presence of consciousness emerging. One gray afternoon, Jung entered the room and found Friedrich observing his own hand. He turned it slowly, as if examining something he had never seen. "Why does it obey me?" Jung smiled. "Because you believe it is yours." Friedrich remained silent. That simple phrase echoed within him for days. What else did he believe was his that was in fact merely a borrowed idea? Hill would call this the great illusion of possession, the belief that we control what we think, when in fact we are controlled by what we unconsciously think. The professor began to realize that he was not master of his reactions, beliefs, or even his feelings. Everything about him was a repetition of something learned, inherited, conditioned. He who claimed to have mastered the truth now barely mastered his own impulse to judge. As his health returned, Jung allowed him to take short walks through the corridors. It was during these moments that Friedrich's mind became. He observed the other patients, saw fragments of himself in each one. The man screaming alone at the end of the corridor seemed like his repressed rage. The woman speaking to the void reflected his need heard. The elderly man crying silently reminded him of his own inability for help. Each face was a mirror. Hill, through his mental, would explain that reality multiplies according to the frequency you emit. Friedrich now understood this without needing formulas. The world reacted to his vibration. He had vibrated fear, control, and distrust throughout his life. When he was finally discharged, he returned home and realized how much that place reflected his former inner state. The heavy curtains blocked the light. The books were stacked rigidly, almost militarily. The windows were locked. Everything exuded order and isolation. He spent the first few days simply walking through the rooms, unsure of where to begin to change, until something prompted him to open a window. Fresh air rushed in, carrying the smell of the street, the sound of cars, distant voices. It was a simple but symbolic gesture. Hill would say that the mind, like a house, needs air. Stagnant thought sickens, and the new only enters when the old opens to escape. Friedrich dreamed he was standing in front of a dust-covered mirror. He brushed it away with his hands until he saw a familiar face. Younger, more alive. The reflection smiled, and the smile wasn't mocking, it was compassionate. "You created monsters, but you wouldn't admit you were afraid," the image said, "and you fought them until you thought they were a part of you." When he awoke, he felt strangely light. For the first time, there was no urgency to blame. Silence. And in that silence began to sprout something Hill called the seed of self-observation, the point at which a person stops reacting and begins to see. Friedrich began practicing a new habit. Every time he felt anger or judgment, he didn't act. He simply observed the feeling. At first, it was like trying to hold back a wave with his hand. Over time, something changed. The waves came, and he let them pass. One day, upon hearing a critical comment about his work, he felt the old irritation rise. Instinctively, he almost responded sarcastically, but something stopped him. He took a breath and realized, it's not the person who irritates me, it's the reflex they trigger. The irritation subsided, and in its place arose curiosity. What was inside him that still needed to be acknowledged? Hill called this process emotional transmutation, when the energy of impulse transforms into insight. Even so, the old mind still tried to sabotage him. Sometimes he would wake with bitter thoughts, judging everything and everyone. Other times, he would feel a deep sadness, as if something inside him mourned the loss of the former power to blame. At such times, he remembered Hill's invisible words. The greatest human vice is to point out what is born within. He understood that healing is not a straight line. The mind tries to return to the comfort of the known, even if the known is suffering. Yet with each relapse, he awoke a little more awake. One morning, while walking through the park, he saw a man arguing on the phone. His tone was aggressive, his anger evident. For a moment, Friedrich felt that old moral impulse to condemn others' behavior. But before the thought could take hold, an inner voice interrupted him. You were once him, and he understood. Every human being at some point is the one who screams, who judges, who fears, who accuses. No one is immune to the shadow. The difference lies in who chooses to recognize it. He looked at the man and felt something unexpected. Empathy. For the first time, he understood what Hill meant when he wrote that true strength is born when a man sees in another the same battlefield he wages within. As the days passed, Friedrich began to feel a different energy circulating in his. Small things changed. The coffee seemed tastier, the silence more bearable, people's faces less threatening. The distrust that had once consumed him gave way to curiosity. Each encounter became a moving mirror, and he began to observe humanity as if reading a book full of symbols. He realized that people don't lie because they're bad, because they're afraid of not being loved if they tell. That envy is just a disguised form of unacknowledged admiration. That manipulation is a desperate plea for security. Everything I once saw as malice now revealed itself as ignorance of my own. And it was at this point that the true mystery began. One night, while rereading old philosophical texts, Friedrich came across a note he had made years before. Virtue is the mastery of the mind over instinct. Cited. someone perhaps he himself had scrawled, or instinct that has learned to cooperate with them. This phrase intrigued him. It seemed to come from a future he had not yet experienced. Hill is said to have said that wisdom always leaves traces in the past for the man awakening in the present. The phrase seemed like a code left by his more conscious self. Friedrich understood that perhaps the truth lay not in choosing between light and shadow, but in integrating them. As he closed the book, he felt a different calm, not the calm of certainty, surrender. He knew there was still much to discover, but he no longer feared what he would find. With each thought that arose, he perceived an echo of Hill's invisible laws. Every repressed energy seeks expression, every denial becomes destiny, and every judgment is but a mirror of what man has yet to accept. Friedrich was not cured. He was waking up. An awakening, as Hill wrote, not the end of sleep. It is the moment when the dreamer realizes that he has always created the dream. Outside, dawn was tinging the sky with a golden hue. The professor watched the light slowly invade the room and felt as if the world, for the first time, there were no more mirrors, open silent field full of. And as the sun rose, he understood that the fight against the shadow was over. Real work would now begin, learning to walk with it. Friedrich's mind began to reorganize, a devastated field after a storm. The man who had previously seen the world in black and white now perceived nuances, shadows, details. It was as if the veil of certainty had torn, and behind it emerged a landscape far more complex than he could bear. He saw intentions where before he had seen only actions, perceived fears hidden beneath banal gestures, and sensed something in people he couldn't name, a mixture of pain and self-protection. Jung said this was the price of consciousness, seeing more than one desire. Hill, in his immortal silence, completed the lesson. What man calls reality is only the reflection of the degree of lucidity he can bear. And Friedrich began to bear more. It was an invisible, almost painful process. He felt torn between the urge to understand and the fear of what he would discover. Everything around him seemed the same. Same faces, same voices, same streets, but his perception had changed. With each encounter, he noticed a subtle, unconscious choreography. The look that avoided his gaze, the words spoken to please, the gesture that betrayed insecurity. Friedrich perceived the human theater, and, at the same time, recognized his own role on this stage. For the first time, he saw himself not above others, but within the same plot. And this realization liberated and terrified him at the time. As if conscience were a double-edged blade, cuts through lies, but also through comfort. One silent night, as he wrote in his notebook, a question struck him with almost physical force. How many of my certainties were born of the fear of being wrong? He closed his eyes, let the thought expand. The answer came as a sensation, a weight in his chest, as if something there needed to be expelled. Hill said that fear is the root of all mental prisons. Man calls it conviction to disguise shame. Friedrich understood. The truths he held most dearly were the ones that imprisoned him most. How many of our beliefs are just disguises for fear? In the following days, he began observing people with a new, almost scientific curiosity. He noticed how they reacted when contradicted, how they changed their tone of voice when defending an idea, how they used morality to hide their pride. But what surprised him was realizing that he did the same. It was like watching a living reflection of one's own mind, and psyche is mirrored, and every interaction is a test of recognition. Will you see the other, or will you see yourself? This phrase accompanied him like a secret compass. He began to experience a curious phenomenon. The more he recognized other people's shadows as his own, the less they affected him. What once irritated him now aroused compassion. What once threatened him now taught him. It was as if the world had become a classroom, each person a pedagogical mirror. But this learning came at a price. At times, he felt a different kind of loneliness, not from a lack of people, but from an excess of perception. Seeing too much can be as painful as seeing nothing at all. Consciousness is a lens, he'll say. Every lens magnifies the light, but also the heat. Can clarity also burn? One afternoon, in an old bookstore, Friedrich found a forgotten book among the shelves, a worn copy of Napoleon Hill's The Laws of Creative Thinking. It was an old edition, with a worn cover and yellowed edges. When he opened it, he found a sentence underlined by someone who had read it before him. Man does not flee from darkness, he flees from the light that forces him to see his own shadow. The impact was immediate. This summed up his entire journey. He realized that all his life, he had fled not from the evil of others, but from his own ability to be like. Hill called this the law of neutrality, the point at which man stops classifying and begins to understand. In the days that followed, Friedrich began practicing a silent exercise, observing without labeling. He looked at people and tried to simply see, without judgment. At first, it was nearly impossible. His mind, conditioned by decades of comparison, immediately created stories. Arrogant, he's weak, that's fake. But over time, something changed. The noise subsided. His gaze became clearer. He began to realize that every human behavior is an attempt to preserve something precious, a sense of dignity. Even lying stems from the fear of losing love. Even aggression is a defense of one's own fragility. Why do we find it so difficult to forgive if we all strive for the same inner shelter? In a later conversation, Jung watched him closely. He began to understand projection. But there is still one step left, recognizing what it tries to protect. Friedrich remained silent. Jung continued, projection is not the enemy. It is the messenger of what you could not bear to acknowledge. This phrase echoed in his mind for days. Hill would translate the same idea into spiritual language. All denied energy seeks expression. If you do not use it consciously, it will use you. This was exactly what had been happening. Friedrich was beginning to realize that every judgment was a disguised confession. By calling someone manipulative, he betrayed his fear of manipulation. By calling another selfish, he revealed his own desire to put himself first. That night, he conducted an experiment. He took a sheet of paper and wrote down all the behaviors that most irritated him. Then, one by one, he asked himself, where does this live in me? The answers came slowly, but he discovered small manipulations in his everyday gestures, subtle ways of wanting to be admired, unconscious ways of maintaining control over his surroundings. He realized that the shadow wasn't a monster hiding in the basement. It was a collection of invisible habits, all disguised as virtue. Hill had warned him, most dangerous evil is good in disguise. Friedrich finally understood. Could it be that what we call morality is just fear that is learned to wear pretty clothes? As he accepted this idea, a new feeling emerged. It wasn't guilt or shame, but relief. The burden of maintaining a perfect image began. He realized he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The struggle to be exemplary had become a prison, and freedom began with the simple act of I am human. Hill said, the free man is not the one who purifies himself, but the one who knows himself. And Friedrich was finally beginning to know himself. In this new phase, he began to notice a subtle and fascinating phenomenon. The more he accepted his own imperfections, the kinder the world became. Conflicts diminished, conversations became more relaxed, and people reacted differently. It was as if reality was molding itself to his new internal state. He remembered Hill's words, inner vibration is the invisible architecture of circumstance. Now he understood that the world doesn't change first. It's the observer who changes. But to what extent is reality moldable? And what happens when man begins to see his own power? Friedrich sensed there was something beyond, an even deeper dimension behind this perception. It was as if, behind every emotion, there was a silent intelligence trying to guide him. He was beginning to understand that the mind is not the enemy of the soul. It is merely a misaligned tool that needs to be realigned. Jung called it integration. Hill called it mental transmutation. But both spoke of the same thing, the point at which man ceases to be a plaything of his impulses and becomes a conscious creator. That early morning, as the wind blew against the windows and the clock struck 3, Friedrich wrote in his notebook, no longer want to be innocent, I want to be whole. And there, in that simple phrase, something took hold. He finally understood that the purity he sought lay not in eliminating the shadow, but in embracing it as part of the whole. Hill, had he been there, would have whispered the final revelation of this stage. The soul evolves not by denying the darkness, by the art of illuminating what sleeps within it. And so, Friedrich closed the notebook. The lamp's flame flickered, casting its shadow on the wall. For the first time, he looked at that dark figure and felt no fear, only recognition, because now he knew the shadow wasn't the enemy. Map. And following that map would require courage, the courage to keep descending, even when everyone else still believed they were ascending. Friedrich was beginning to experience the power of conscious observation. What had previously been merely theory, in Jung's words, metaphor in Napoleon Hill's writings, now became direct experience. He perceived the body as a compass, a map that translated the invisible states of the mind. When he became angry, his chest tightened. When he lied, his stomach contracted. When he feigned serenity, his hands trembled slightly. It was as if the body were speaking the truth that the ego had not yet accepted. Jung called this somatic awareness. Hill would call it the mind in a state of witnessing, the point at which a person stops reacting and begins to decode the signals they themselves emit. One day, during a conversation with Jung, Friedrich recounted a curious episode. He was at a faculty meeting. A younger colleague presented a groundbreaking idea on moral philosophy. While the others praised him, he felt an immediate, almost physical irritation. I felt he was trying to ridicule me. Jung asked, "Did he ridicule you?" Friedrich hesitated. "No, but the way he spoke bothered me." Jung smiled. "Discomfort is compass. What did he touch in you?" Friedrich remained silent but then replied, "Ambition." I can't bear to see ambition. Jung inclined his head. Why not? He couldn't answer. Hill, if he had been present, would have said that this was the precise moment when the unconscious revealed its secret, the moment when the mind recognizes in the other the reflection of what it has repressed. Over the next few weeks, Friedrich began practicing what he called inner listening. Every time he felt offended, judged someone, or formed an instant opinion, he tried to listen to his body before listening to his mind. He discovered patterns. His chest tightened whenever he saw decisive people. His jaw clenched when someone disagreed with him. His stomach ached when he had to admit a mistake. The body does not lie, Hill wrote. It is the soul's diary, written in sensations. This realization completely changed his way of life. What had once been conflict now became given code for interpreting himself. He began to understand that physical reaction precedes mental interpretation. The body reacts to unconscious memory, or thought formulates a justification. One night, while walking through the city streets, Friedrich experienced an intense sense of déjà vu. Everything seemed the same, yet strangely alive. Streetlights flickered with a warmer hue. Sounds seemed to echo from within his mind, and people passing by moved like symbols. He described the sensation as seeing the world from within consciousness, rather than the other way around. Hill called this perceptual inversion, the moment when a person ceases to live as an effect and becomes a cause. It is then that he realizes that he is not walking within the world, but that the world is walking within him. This realization brought back memories that seemed impossible to ignore. Friedrich began to associate seemingly random events with his own internal states. When he woke up resentful, the day was filled with small provocations, long lines, harsh conversations, delays. When he woke up calm, the same events seemed harmless. It was as if reality reconfigured itself according to his He even tested it. One morning he woke up irritated and decided to deliberately shift his mental frequency. He took a deep breath, thought of something he was grateful for, and repeated a quote he'd read by Hill. Nothing external has power over a man who controls his vibration. The day unfolded harmoniously, even with unexpected events. He recorded everything in a notebook, noting times and emotions. After 3 weeks, he noticed a mathematical pattern. The days with the most negative incidents coincided with the days he woke up feeling stressed. The mind was the trigger for good and bad. One day, while reflecting on this, he received a letter from an old college classmate. She reported experiencing panic attacks, fondly remembering their old philosophical discussions. She asked for help, saying she could no longer distinguish between real fear and Friedrich became thoughtful. He responded with a long letter, explaining that fear always stems from the future, and that the future is merely a mental projection. He wrote, "The brain projects threats not to deceive you, but to prepare you. The error lies in believing that every prediction is." As he sent the letter, he realized that for the first time he was writing not as a professor, but as someone speaking from experience. He was transforming pain into wisdom, exactly what Hill called emotional alchemy. A few weeks later, he received another letter from his colleague. She said she had begun writing down every fearful thought and confronting it with reality. "I have discovered that 90% of what I fear doesn't happen." Friedrich smiled. This was the same proportion he himself had discovered in his judgments of others. 9 out of 10 perceptions were projections. Only 1 was real. This made him reflect on the structure of the human mind. Perhaps the evolution had built the brain to see danger before peace as a survival mechanism. Hill said that the mind still operates as if we were in caves. It would rather err on the side of suspicion than on the side of naivete. That was it. Projection was a primitive instinct disguised as modern morality. Intrigued by this idea, Friedrich immersed himself in neuroscience. He discovered that researchers like Roy Baumeister had proven something fascinating. People with a high degree of emotional projection exhibit less activity in brain regions linked to self-reflection. It was as if the brain turned off its internal mirror to endure the discomfort of seeing itself. He also read about mirror neuron cells that fire inside our brains when we observe someone else acting, internally simulating the same emotion. If we see anger, we activate anger. If we see ambition, we feel ambition. But if we reject that emotion, the mind commits an attribution error. It believes the feeling belongs to the other. Science confirmed what Hill had already intuited decades earlier. The man who runs from his thoughts will be pursued by them disguised as people. These discoveries rekindled an almost youthful enthusiasm in Friedrich. He began to apply this knowledge to small, everyday situations. When someone criticized him, he didn't react. He would close his eyes for a second and ask, "What exactly am I?" Sometimes it was anger, shame, sometimes envy disguised as indignation. Each response was a key that unlocked a new layer of the unconscious, and the deeper he descended, the more power he found. He realized that every repressed feeling was trapped energy life force transformed into tension. Hill called this the principle of emotional transmutation. The energy of anger, when understood, transforms into creative impulse, the energy of envy into inspiration. Fear lucid prudence. Nothing is lost. Everything transforms according to the level of consciousness that serves it. One night, an unlikely event confirmed his findings. He was returning home when, at the entrance to his building, he encountered the assistant he believed had robbed him years before. The man, visibly moved, explained that he was writing a book and wanted to thank him for their previous acquaintance. He said that period, though tense, had spurred him to pursue an academic. Friedrich listened in silence. As the other man spoke, he noticed something extraordinary. There was no longer any anger, only a slight warmth in his chest. The memory that had once burned now seemed neutral. When they said goodbye, he felt a profound peace. Hill would write of this as the emotional zero point, moment when previously distorted energy returns to balance. As he climbed the stairs, he realized that something had changed forever. He was no longer the man who saw enemies everywhere. In the following days, he began to notice how this neutrality transformed everything around. People who had previously avoided him approached him. Conversations that had been tense flowed more easily. Reality seemed to respond gently to his inner shift. Hill explained it simply. The mind that harmonizes with its own conflict dissolves conflict in the world. Friedrich began to grasp the true depth of this law. He no longer needed to understand all the causes, nor analyze every thought. He simply observed, breathed, and allowed the feeling to pass. Awareness alone did the work of transformation. Over time, he noticed another curious phenomenon. The more observant he became, the more his intuition heightened. He began to anticipate people's reactions, mood swings before they expressed themselves, pick up on subtle energy shifts, surroundings. It was as if inner silence amplified his perception. Jung called this psychic synchronicity. Hill described it as vibrational alignment. The difference between the two was merely a matter of language. Both spoke of the same state, the moment when the mind stops interfering, begins to perceive the intelligence that organizes everything. Friedrich now walked the streets with a calm but attentive gaze. He saw the world as a system of living mirrors, all reflecting the same essence disguised in different forms. He understood what Hill meant when he said that the universe is mental in its structure and moral in its functioning. Morality was not an imposed rule, a natural result of inner coherence. When the mind aligns with truth, life responds with order. When it aligns with lies, it responds with chaos. It was simple, but simplicity demands courage. That night, writing in his diary, Friedrich noted, "The body warned me before the mind. Emotion came before the story. And when I stopped telling stories, I found peace." He closed the notebook and turned off the light. The shadow on the wall no longer frightened him. It was merely the outline of something that had always been there, waiting to be. He smiled and thought of Hill. Everything a man fears to look at contains the power he seeks. Now he knew there was no turning back. The projection had become a mirror, a window, and through it he was finally beginning to see the real. Friedrich's transformation seemed complete, but the real test had not yet begun. After months of inner silence, observation, and lucidity, something unexpected grew within him again, an old, almost forgotten feeling, pride of being awake. He didn't realize it, but his mind was beginning to don the cloak of superiority again, now disguised as enlightenment. People sought him for advice, students listened to him with devotion, colleagues treated him with renewed respect. He saw himself as someone who finally understood the workings of the psyche. This, though it seemed like a virtue, was merely the shadow returning in another form. Napoleon Hill would write that the ego is the subtlest architect of failure, for it builds palaces of wisdom on the foundations of pride. Friedrich was about to discover how literal this truth was. During a lecture at a university, he was confronted by a young researcher who disagreed with his idea. The criticism was mild, but something inside him reacted with keen fury. As he responded with apparent calm, he felt his heart race, his jaw harden, his mind racing for arguments to destroy the other. In that instant, he realized the paradox. He was projecting again. The same mechanism he had spent years studying now possessed him once more, and with even greater force, because it hid behind the appearance of consciousness. He left the room distraught, feeling that something had broken. Hill is quoted as saying, "The shadow is not conquered by the light, but by humility before it." That night, when he got home, he sat in front of the mirror and saw himself as he hadn't seen himself in a long time, tired, tense, human. He stood there for long minutes, till a thought emerged with piercing clarity. He still wanted to be special. All his search for understanding, all his discipline, still had the same old goal, to prove himself different, superior, incorruptible. His mind had merely changed its map. Where once there had been morality, now there was enlightenment. It was the same voice, only more refined. The spiritual ego, Hill would say, is the shadow's last disguise. Friedrich felt shame, but also relief. For the first time, he didn't try to justify his mistake. He simply accepted it. In the following days, he decided to silence the sage. He stopped giving lectures, declined invitations, avoided praise. He wanted to understand what remained when admiration ceased. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, almost painful. Without the approval of others, the old emptiness returned. It was the same abyss as always, but now he observed it carefully. He realized that the emptiness was not punishment, but space. The same space that Hill described as the interval between thought and creation. All strength is born of a vacuum. When man loses the echo of the world, he begins to hear the voice of the soul. It was during this period that Jung visited him. The analyst's gaze was calm but firm. "You have discovered the shadow's last trick," he said. "It dresses itself in virtue when it realizes it can no longer deceive you with weakness." Friedrich listened in silence. Jung then invited him to do an exercise. "Close your eyes and imagine the figure that scares you most within yourself." He obeyed. He saw a man in a dark suit with a calculating look, smiling wryly. "Who is he?" "Jung, a strategist," Friedrich replied. "Part one, always hated. Talk to him." And something extraordinary happened. The figure responded calmly. "I never wanted to destroy you. I only wanted to help you. You called me a manipulator, so I learned to act in the shadows, but I never stopped working for you." Friedrich wept. It was like hearing a confession from himself. The strategist continued. "When you rejected me, I lost control and began using you without realizing it. But if you accept me, I can serve." Strategy is not the enemy of ethics. Conscience does not override instinct, it only guides it. He opened his eyes, stunned. Jung watched silently, knowing that this moment was decisive. Hill would have said that this is true transmutation, when a person talks to their own shadow and realizes that it is brute force awaiting direction. Over the next few days, Friedrich repeated the exercise alone. Every trait he had previously condemned took on a new function. Pride became a sense of dignity. The desire for control became a capacity for planning. Ambition, previously denied, transformed into a creative impulse. It was what Hill called the active reintegration of opposing energy. He now understood that to deny an instinct is to surrender it to the unconscious. To embrace it is to make it an ally. This discovery brought a sense of calm power, unlike the euphoria of previous victories. It was a noiseless, almost silent force, as if the parts of the mind had finally stopped fighting each other. Fate, as always, tested his learning. A few months later, the university faced an administrative crisis, political intrigue, job disputes, failed accusations. Friedrich was invited to take over as department director. He initially refused, saying he no longer wanted to deal with power. But something deep inside made him reconsider. Escape is also a form of ego, He accepted the position on one condition. He would not use his authority to control, but to harmonize. At first, his colleagues greeted him with suspicion. Everyone expected the same rigid professor as before. Instead, they found a man who listened more than he spoke. Over time, something rare happened. The once chaotic meetings became productive. His critical colleagues began to collaborate. The atmosphere of rivalry gave way to a sense of collective purpose. Friedrich discovered that true power lies not in imposing, but in enabling. That a conscious leader does not manipulate, but instills responsibility. Hill is quoted as saying, "When a man masters himself, he need not master anyone." The university flourished under his leadership, and he became a reference in mediation and human management. This time, success did not flatter him. He knew that merit lay in the process. One autumn night, walking alone through the empty, he heard the echo of his own footsteps and thought about everything he had experienced, from collapse to integration, arrogance to serenity. It was hard to believe that this man was the same man who had once accused the entire world of betrayal. He looked out the window and saw his reflection mixed with that of the illuminated city. For the first time, he didn't want to separate the two. He understood that there was no him and the world. Everything was part of the same movement. Hill would write that integrated consciousness seeks not to be light, but to understand the darkness that sustains it. Before leaving, he passed the old auditorium and saw a light on. He entered. On the stage, a group of students were rehearsing a play about philosophy and morality. He sat in the back watching. At one point, an actress recited a line that stopped him in his tracks. "He who fights monsters must be careful not to become one." It was from Nietzsche, the same author who had inspired him early in his career. Friedrich smiled. The circle had closed. He finally understood what the philosopher was trying to say. The real danger never lies in others, but in the part of us that feels invulnerable. As he left the auditorium, the wind blew hard. He took a deep breath and thought of Napoleon Hill. He remembered a quote that now made perfect sense. "The wise man seeks not to eliminate his demons, but to educate them." He walked through the night with the serenity of someone who no longer needs to prove anything. He was neither a saint nor a sinner. He was simply human, whole, conscious, and at peace with his shadows. But as he crossed the street, one final question flashed through his mind. What if the shadow wasn't the end of the journey, beginning of something even greater? This doubt lingered in the air, like a flame that he knew, with the clarity with which a dream ends, that the answer would come, but only when he was ready to see it. Friedrich was no longer the same man who had once sought justice in the world. Now he walked with slow steps, like someone who had finally learned to match the rhythm of time. Seemed to move differently around him, no longer as an enemy or a threat, but as a mirror reflecting what he had become. Each morning was a lesson, each gesture a reminder that consciousness is not a sudden achievement, but a state renewed with each choice. He understood, with serenity, what Napoleon Hill always meant when he wrote that the mind is a power plant that never shuts down. The difference between light and darkness is in the one who turns the switch. Friedrich, at last, had learned to operate his. The days were simple. He drank coffee in silence, watched the people on the street, and saw in each of them the same quest that had once consumed him, the desire to be right, to be seen, to be loved, without having to shed his own mask. Now, however, he realized that there is no true love without transparency. He understood that a person can only be loved for who they are, never for what the shadow that once shamed him had become his source of compassion. When he saw someone react with anger, pride, or fear, he didn't see enemies. He saw old versions of himself trying to survive, and in that, there was tenderness. Hill would call this stage expanded consciousness, the point at which judgment dissolves, begins to see pain, natural part of the mind's evolution. One afternoon, while walking in the park, he noticed a child playing with her own reflection in a puddle. The girl laughed every time the reflection distorted, and when the wind shattered the image, she didn't cry. She just waited for the water to calm down so she could see herself again. Friedrich stopped and watched, fascinated. He realized that life was exactly like this. The reflection distorts, the image breaks, but the face remains. We don't lose who we are when we make mistakes. We simply fail to recognize ourselves until the mind comes. And when it does, the vision returns, clearer and deeper than before. Hill is quoted as saying that the calm mind creates no illusion. It reveals what was already there, hidden by movement. In the months that followed, Friedrich began writing a book. Not a philosophical treatise, but a kind of letter to the future, a guide for those seeking to understand themselves or blaming the world. The title came spontaneously, The Art of Seeing with the Shadow. He described his discoveries not as absolute truths, but as exercises in perception. One was simple. Whenever you feel anger, ask yourself what exactly this emotion is trying to protect you from. When you feel envy, ask yourself what it is showing you that you haven't yet allowed yourself. When you feel contempt, look closely. What in you fear is like that which you condemn. These questions, he said, are like keys that unlock the unconscious. Hill asserted that the right questions are the language of the inner teachers, and Friedrich now saw how true this was. Over time, his book began to circulate among students, therapists, and the curious. Many said he had simplified complex concepts, transforming abstract ideas into daily practices. But Friedrich knew the merit wasn't his. It was the human process of learning from pain itself. He received letters from readers telling how they began to observe their own reaction, how they realized how much they projected onto others the weaknesses they couldn't tolerate in themselves. One woman reported that after years of criticizing her husband for being distant, she realized it was she who kept the distance out of fear of giving herself. A young man said that upon recognizing his vanity, he discovered that behind it lay only a sincere desire to be accepted. Friedrich read each letter with silent tears. The shadow had finally fulfilled its purpose, to unite, not divide. He also noticed something curious. The most transformed people were not those who grasped the concepts intellectually, but those who began applying small observations to their daily lives. They transformed irritation into insight, guilt into self-accountability, judgment into empathy. This reminded him of one of Hill's laws. Thought becomes power only when it finds expression in action. Friedrich realized that spiritual knowledge without practice is mere vanity, disguised as wisdom. What changes destiny is not understanding the mind, it is observing what it does in each moment. This is true practice. In one of his last conversations with Jung, Friedrich asked, if everyone did this work, if everyone faced their shadows, would the world be a better place? Jung responded with an almost paternal calm. The world is only the sum of individual consciousnesses. Each person who integrates transforms a small part of the collective reality. It is slow, but it is inevitable. Hill would say the same thing differently. The man who governs his mind alters the field in which the universe operates. Friedrich smiled as he realized the two views converged. Psychology and spiritual philosophy said the same thing, that humanity does not change by decree, it changes by the sum of awakened mind. In the final chapter of his book, Friedrich wrote an invitation that felt more like a confession. Observe your reflection before accusing the mirror. When the world seems hostile, ask yourself where you still treat yourself with hostility. When someone hurts you, look at what it awakens in you. The shadow doesn't come to destroy you. It comes to teach you what you haven't yet learned about life. He concluded with the phrase that summed up everything he had experienced. You don't get enlightened by running from the darkness, but by learning to walk through it with your eyes open. Gradually, Friedrich's story became a metaphor for something larger, a universal reminder that every human being is a field of light and shadow, trying to balance itself. Most spend their lives trying to erase half of themselves, but those who understand the game discover that it is precisely this denied half that holds the energy. Hill described this point as the turning point of creative consciousness, the moment when a person stops reacting to the world and begins creating it from the. Friedrich had arrived there, not through perfection, but through acceptance. You, hearing these words, may feel something inside you shift. Perhaps you remembered someone who judged you unfairly, or how many times you've projected pain onto others without realizing it. Perhaps you're seeing yourself for the first time through less harsh eyes. This is the beginning of the journey. Don't try to eliminate what you just observe. Every emotion contains a message, and every reaction is an invitation to know yourself better. When you begin to recognize your own shadows, you'll realize something extraordinary. The world around you changes with it, because deep down, it has always been just a mirror of what you allow yourself to see. Now it's your turn to apply it. Start today. Observe your judgments. Ask yourself what they reveal about you. Breathe before reacting. Transform discomfort into curiosity. Little by little, you'll see the same patterns once hurt you dissolve, because they no longer encounter resistance. This is how light wins, not through force, through awareness. Friedrich followed this path to the end and discovered that freedom is not about being above the shadows, but walking with them. If this story touched you, if something within you was awakened, share this journey. Like this video, leave your comment. You can leave it anonymously if you wish, and subscribe to the channel to continue expanding your consciousness with us. As Napoleon Hill would say, no one liberates himself alone. Every awakened mind becomes a lamp that's another. May your light now find the next eye that needs awakening.